The consequences of incest, when it generates fatal syndromes, transcend generations and devastate whole families. This was nowhere more evident than in the isolated mountains of eastern Kentucky, where the history of the Harland family remained buried for decades until its final exposure in 1967. With their dense forests and deep valleys, the Appalachian Hills served as a perfect refuge for communities wishing to remain separated from the rest of society. Among these steep slopes, approximately 50 kilometers from the nearest city, the Harland family lived, their lineage dating back to the first European settlers in the region in the 18th century. The first to document the case was Dr. Robert Caldwell, a rural doctor who attended Kentucky's most remote communities. In his own words, recorded in his medical diary, he wrote, "In my 35 years of medicine, never have I witnessed such a concentration of congenital anomalies in a single family. The Harlands seemed to carry the weight of generations of consanguineous unions. Accessible only by a narrow dirt road that served the mountain was the Harland property. Visitors were rare, and contact with outsiders was avoided by the family." When Dr. Caldwell first arrived at the property in response to an urgent call about a child with breathing difficulties, he was not prepared for what he would find. A worn, two-story wood structure was the main house, surrounded by smaller huts spread across the property. In that family complex, 32 people lived in total. The patriarch, Jacob Harland, was 68 years old in 1967 and possessed a permanently severe expression. His wife Margaret was also his first cousin, but the true impact of consanguinity was revealed in the third generation. Of the 9 sons of Jacob and Margaret, 7 had married among cousins. From these marriages, 23 children were born, 17 of whom had serious development problems. Distinctive characteristics were immediately noticed by Dr. Caldwell: prominent jaws, very close-set eyes, clenched fingers, and, in various cases, severe intellectual deficiency. The most serious case was that of Timothy, a 12-year-old boy with a Pert syndrome, a rare condition characterized by craniofacial malformations and fused fingertips. The son of 2 first cousins, Samuel and Ruth Harland, was Timothy. The boy had difficulty breathing and suffered from constant pain due to pressure in his brain, a condition caused by the premature fusion of his skull bones. The geographical isolation of the family had been just the beginning. Over the passing generations, social isolation had become absolute. With an iron hand, Jacob Harland ruled his family, discouraging any contact with the outside world. Schools were not attended by the children. Modern medicine was viewed with distrust, and marriages were arranged inside the family circle. "We preserve our lineage," Jacob told Dr. Caldwell during his first visit. "Pure blood, without contamination from the outside world." An unprecedented case of genetic isolation was what the doctor soon realized he was facing. Meticulously, he began documenting each family member, their kinship relationships, and medical conditions, creating what would become one of the most important case studies on the effects of consanguinity in the history of American medicine. However, a broader investigation was what the medical case soon became. Alerted by Dr. Caldwell's preliminary report, local authorities began to question whether the children were being deprived of appropriate medical care and mandatory education. In June 1967, social workers visited the property, accompanied by the local sheriff. What they found was described as medieval conditions. Children with more severe disabilities were kept in separate rooms, some tied to beds to prevent them from injuring themselves. Medical records were non-existent, and several children had never been officially registered. The attention of the local press was quickly gained by the case. A cover story was published by the Louisville Courier-Journal with the title, "The Forgotten Family of the Mountains," reporting the precarious conditions and genetic anomalies found among the Harlands. The report carefully avoided sensationalism, but the severity of the situation was made clear. Check it out if you are already subscribed to this channel so as not to lose any of the most impactful cases of genetic isolation ever documented in American history. These hidden stories that shaped entire communities and warn about the real dangers of consanguinity are what your subscription helps us continue to investigate. The history of the Harlands did not start in 1967. To completely understand how a family came to such a degree of genetic isolation, we need to return to the late 18th century when the first Harland reached the mountains of Kentucky. A Scottish immigrant, Ezekiel Harland, established himself in the region around 1795, seeking to escape what he called the corruption of the eastern cities. 200 acres of mountainous land were bought by him, a log cabin was built, and he began raising his family away from the eyes of expanding society. The historical records of the county show that Ezekiel married his high school cousin, Hannah, bringing with him a cultural pattern that was not uncommon at the time, especially among isolated communities. In rural, isolated communities of the 18th and early 19th century, marriage between cousins was not only accepted but often encouraged as a way of maintaining properties within families. These first colonizing families faced a very different reality from ours, explains local historian Martin Thornbury, who extensively studied the isolated communities of the Appalachians. Geographic isolation meant a limited group of potential marriage partners, and economic considerations that are completely unknown to us today often prevailed. The isolation of the Harlands was further deepened by the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865. While Kentucky officially remained in the Union, the region was deeply divided. With their distrust of government authorities, the Harlands withdrew even deeper into the mountains during this turbulent period. It is during this time that the diaries of Josiah Harland, great-grandson of Ezekiel, offer a rare view of the family mindset. In an entry dated 1863, he wrote, "The world outside is shattering in war and madness. Here in the mountains, we preserve our way of life, our lineage, our traditions. We are the last guardians of the true American spirit." Central to the Harland identity became this rhetoric of purity and preservation. With each generation, isolation was not only geographical but ideological. Children were taught early on that the outside world was corrupt and dangerous and that their union, literally, was what the family's survival depended on. The 1880 census records 18 Harlands living on the original property, now expanded to 320 acres. Of these, 15 had the surname Harland, suggesting that marriages within the family were already common. The census also notes that 3 children were listed as disabled, although the nature of the conditions was not specified. Dramatic changes to rural America were brought by the turn of the century, but the Harlands were little impacted. While roads, phones, and eventually electricity reached increasingly remote communities, the family deliberately remained on the sidelines of these advances. A 1948 report by the Kentucky Electric Company mentions that the Harlands refused the installation of electric lines on their property, preferring to continue with kerosene lamps. This technological isolation reinforced their social isolation. Without radios or newspapers, the family remained disconnected from world events. The Great Depression, the 2 World Wars, all these transformative historical events barely touched the closed universe of the Harlands. It was during the 1930s that Jacob Harland, the patriarch Dr. Caldwell would find decades later, took the lead of the family. Under his direction, the rules of marriage within the family became even more rigid. Local church documents show that he formally removed his family from the Baptist congregation in 1935 after a sermon where the local pastor spoke against marriages among close relatives. His own religious interpretation was developed by Jacob, based on selective readings of the Bible and family traditions. This homemade religion emphasized the purity of the lineage and saw the Harlands as a chosen people designed to preserve values the rest of the world had abandoned. So complete was the family's isolation that during the polio vaccination campaign in the 1950s, health officials did not even know of the existence of many of the Harland children. Only years later, when records were examined after the 1967 intervention, was it found that at least 2 children in the family had died of polio, a disease easily preventable by the Salk vaccine, available since 1955. As we advance to the 1960s, we can see how generations of isolation had created the perfect conditions for a dangerous genetic concentration. No longer was isolation just a cultural or geographical choice, it had been inscribed in the Harland family's very DNA. When Dr. Robert Caldwell began to systematically document the medical conditions of Harland family members in 1967, he was unknowingly contributing to an emerging field of medicine, population genetics. His meticulous records, preserved today at the University of Kentucky, offer one of the most complete case studies on the biological effects of prolonged consanguinity. What we observed in the Harland family is not simply an isolated case of marriage between cousins, but the cumulative result of generations of consanguinity, explained Dr. Elena Simmons, a geneticist at Johns Hopkins University who studied the case in the 1970s. It's like watching centuries of compressed genetic evolution in just a few generations. To understand what happened to the Harlands, we need to examine the foundations of genetics. 2 copies of each gene are carried by each person, one inherited from his mother and one from his father. Recessive are many defective genes. Their effects only manifest when a person inherits 2 copies of the defective gene, one from each parent. In genetically diverse populations, the probability of 2 partners carrying the same defective recessive gene is relatively low. But when close relatives have children, this probability increases dramatically, as they share a significant percentage of their genetic material. Approximately 12.5% of their genes are shared by first-degree cousins. When they get married, the probability of their children inheriting 2 copies of the same defective recessive gene is much larger than in the general population. When this pattern repeats for generations, as in the case of the Harlands, the result is an increasing concentration of deleterious recessive genes in the children. Among the Harland children, Dr. Caldwell documented an impressive variety of rare genetic conditions. In addition to Timothy Zappert syndrome, there were cases of polydactyly, extra fingers on hands or feet, in 6 children, syndactyly, fusion of fingers, in 4 children, retinitis pigmentosa, a degenerative retinal disease that leads to blindness, in 3 teenagers, cleft palate in 5 children, and varying degrees of intellectual disability in 14 children. Particularly remarkable was the case of the identical twins James and John Harland, born in 1955. A rare form of disproportionate dwarfism known as spondyloepiphyseal dysplasia was what both had. This condition, characterized by a short trunk and limbs and problems in the spine, is caused by mutations in the COL2A1 gene, which encodes type 2 collagen, an essential protein for bone and cartilage development. One of the clearest cases of recessive genetic expression observed, Dr. Caldwell noted in his notes about these twins. Their condition was so rare that the likelihood of occurring by chance in a non-consanguineous population would be practically null. The impact of consanguinity was not limited to visible physical conditions. Subsequent studies of the Harland medical records have revealed an abnormally high incidence of congenital heart disease, kidney problems, and rare metabolic disorders. Significantly lower than the national average was the average life expectancy in the family, only 47 years for men and 51 for women, at a time when American life expectancy was already exceeding 70 years. One of the most alarming findings came when Dr. Caldwell examined the unofficial birth records kept by the family itself. Of 49 documented pregnancies between 1945 and 1967, 14 resulted in miscarriages, 7 in stillbirths, and 3 in neonatal deaths in the early weeks of life. A gestational loss rate 3 times higher than the national average of the time is what these numbers represent. Can you imagine the silent suffering of these women? Losing child after child without access to adequate medical care, believing these tragedies were simply the will of God. Leave your comments saying, "What a preventable tragedy," to show how genetic education could have saved so many lives. The phenomenon observed in the Harlands has a scientific name: inbreeding depression. This term describes the reduction in the biological fitness of a population resulting from the accumulation of harmful genetic characteristics due to reproduction between genetically similar individuals. In her definitive report on the family, published in the American Journal of Medical Genetics in 1973, Dr. Simmons wrote, "The Harlands represent an involuntary natural experiment on the effects of prolonged consanguinity. The genetic consequences observed in this family offer undeniable evidence of the biological risks of close relatives reproducing over multiple generations." She continued, "Particularly notable is the prevalence of rare conditions that usually occur at frequencies of less than 1 in 100,000 in the general population. In the Harland family, we find multiple cases of these conditions in a group of only 32 individuals. For the Harlands, these were not abstract statistics, but realities lived daily." Elizabeth Harland, one of the few adults in the family who cooperated extensively with the researchers, described the experience of growing up knowing something was wrong with her family without understanding what it was. "We always knew we were different," she told Dr. Caldwell. "The way the people in the town looked at us when we rarely went there, the laughs of the other children. Jacob said it was because we were special, chosen. I only realized it was because we were sick." The discovery of the Harland family in 1967 triggered a series of government interventions that would forever transform the life of that isolated community. The case quickly escalated from a medical concern to a matter of child welfare, generating a debate on the boundaries between religious freedom, parental rights, and children's protection. In July 1967, a month after the first visit of the social workers, the Kentucky Children's Services Department obtained a temporary court order to examine all Harland children under 18. Fierce was Jacob Harland's resistance. "No one will take my grandchildren," he told the sheriff. "God gave us these children to care for our traditions." The presence of several state police was required for the operation to remove the children for medical evaluation. Witnesses described moving scenes of frightened children being separated from their parents. For many of them, this was the first time they had left the family property. At the Kentucky Regional Hospital, specialized doctors confirmed Dr. Caldwell's preliminary diagnoses and discovered additional, untreated conditions. Timothy, the boy with Apert syndrome, was immediately underwent surgery to relieve pressure on his brain. 3 other children were diagnosed with congenital heart disease that required surgical intervention. A test for the legal system quickly became the case. In August 1967, the county youth court held a custody hearing that lasted 5 days. Experts in medicine, social assistance, and law testified about the conditions on the Harland property. These children were deprived not only of adequate medical care but of the fundamental right to education and the opportunity to develop as individuals, argued Margaret Williams, the lawyer assigned to represent the Harland children. The isolation imposed on them is not only physical, but it represents a form of emotional and intellectual neglect. The family's defense, led by local lawyer Thomas Shepard, countered that the government was improperly interfering with a private religious community that simply wanted to live according to its own traditions. The Harland family represents a disappearing American way of life, Shepard argued. They have the constitutional right to raise their children according to their religious beliefs. A dilemma that echoed broader tensions in American society of the 1960s was faced by Judge William Harrison, the balance between individual rights and collective responsibility. A significant legal precedent was established by his decision, delivered on September 12, 1967. Although this court recognizes the fundamental right of parents to raise their children according to their religious beliefs, stated Judge Harrison, this right is not absolute when it endangers the physical and mental well-being of the children. The evidence presented convincingly demonstrates that the endogamous marriage practices of the Harland family have resulted in significant genetic damage to the children and that the refusal to seek proper medical treatment constituted neglect. The court determined that 17 of the 23 Harland children be placed under temporary state custody for medical treatment and educational assessment. Children with less severe medical conditions could return to their parents after the implementation of a supervision plan that included regular medical visits and school enrollment. Protests from conservative religious groups and defenders of individual freedom were triggered by the decision. A focal point in national debates on the limits of government intervention in family life became the Harland case. Deeply divided opinions were revealed in letters to the editor of the Louisville Courier-Journal. "What happened to the Harland family is nothing less than government tyranny disguised as compassion," wrote a reader from Frankfort, Kentucky. "If we continue to allow personal beliefs to overcome scientific evidence, how many more children will suffer unnecessarily?" countered another from Lexington. For the Harlands themselves, the consequences were immediate and traumatic. The family unit that had persisted for over 150 years was fragmented. Jacob Harland, who had ruled his family with unquestionable authority, saw his world crumble. 3 weeks after the court ruling, he suffered a stroke and died 5 days later. Huge adaptation challenges were faced by the Harland children, many of whom had never interacted with people outside the family. Mary Harland, a social worker designated for the case, unrelated to the family, documented her experiences. The Harland children show extreme levels of separation anxiety and difficulty adapting to new environments. Many show significant delays in social development, with communication patterns and interaction that reflect their extended isolation. Particularly moving was the case of the 8- and 10-year-old brothers, Sarah and Michael Harland. Both had moderate intellectual deficiency and had never been separated before. Placed in different adoptive homes due to their specific medical needs, they developed severe regressive behaviors that required intensive psychological intervention. For some of the older children, integration into the outside world brought a mixture of trauma and liberation. Elizabeth Harland, then 16, wrote in a diary that was later included in the case records, "Everything is scary and strange. The lights are very bright. People talk very fast. But for the first time, I'm learning things that Jacob would never allow us to know. Yesterday, a nurse explained to me why so many babies in our family are born sick or die. It's not God's punishment." Almost 6 decades after the Harland family's discovery, its case continues to influence medicine, law, and social ethics. Far beyond their individual circumstances extends the legacy of this family isolated in the Kentucky mountains, offering valuable lessons to contemporary society. Remarkably diverse life trajectories can now be traced for Jacob Harland's 23 children and grandchildren who lived on the property in 1967. Timothy, the boy with Apert syndrome whose condition initially attracted Dr. Caldwell's attention, received surgery and continuous treatment. Although he never completely overcame his physical and cognitive limitations, he lived until the age of 47, far beyond what would have been possible without medical intervention. He died in 2002 due to cardiac complications related to his condition. Surprisingly different paths were followed by the twins, James and John Harland, with disproportionate dwarfism. John, adopted by a Louisville family with resources for specialized treatments, received an adapted education and eventually graduated from high school. He worked as an accountant for many years and became a defender of the rights of people with disabilities. James, who remained closer to the original community, had less access to educational treatments and opportunities, illustrating how the environment can profoundly influence development even when genetics impose significant challenges. Perhaps the most inspiring story is represented by Sarah Harland, one of the younger children at the time of the intervention. Adopted by a family of university professors, she surpassed her initial developmental delays and eventually graduated in social assistance. In a remarkable turnaround, Sarah dedicated her professional career to working with isolated communities in Appalachia, helping to bring education on reproductive and genetic health to populations that, like her biological family, remained on the fringes of modern society. "I carry the Harlands not only in my DNA, but in my life mission," Sarah stated in a rare interview granted in 2005 for a documentary about the case. "Every community that I help connect with medical and educational resources represents a family like mine that can be spared unnecessary suffering." From a medical point of view, significant advances in understanding recessive genetic diseases have been generated by the Harland case. The family's extensive genetic mapping, which began in the 1970s and continued with more advanced technologies in the following decades, helped researchers identify specific genes associated with various rare conditions. Meticulous records kept on the Harland family have allowed us to track the inheritance of specific genetic mutations through multiple generations, explains Dr. Jennifer Lowe, a geneticist at the University of Kentucky Medical Center. This type of longitudinal study is extremely rare and valuable, offering insights that simply could not be obtained in any other way. In 1989, researchers using preserved family DNA samples identified a specific mutation in the FGFR2 gene responsible for Timothy's Apert syndrome. This discovery later contributed to better prenatal diagnostic methods and early interventions for children born with this condition. In the legal field, the case of Harland versus Kentucky State has established important precedents on the limits of family autonomy when in conflict with child well-being. Cited in more than 40 subsequent cases involving isolated religious communities, Judge Harrison's decision continues to influence the legal balance between religious freedom and child protection. The original property of the Harlands, the subject of legal dispute for many years, was eventually divided among several heirs. The main house, where Jacob Harland once ruled his small, isolated kingdom, was abandoned in the 1980s and destroyed by a fire in 1992. Today, only the stone foundations remain, gradually being claimed by the surrounding forest, a physical reminder of the disappearance of a way of life that lasted for nearly 2 centuries. The ethical implications of the Haaland case remain relevant in the 21st century. With the advent of advanced genetic technologies and consumer DNA tests, issues of genetic counseling, privacy, and reproductive autonomy have gained new urgency. The Haaland case reminds us that scientific knowledge must be democratized, argues Dr. Michael Sanderson, a bioethicist at the University of Chicago. When vital information on genetic health remains concentrated only among the privileged and educated, we perpetuate a system where some communities remain vulnerable to harmful standards that could be avoided. Perhaps the most moving aspect of the Haaland legacy is how it illuminates the tension between tradition and progress, between cultural preservation and individual well-being. In isolated communities that still exist around the world, from closed religious groups to geographically remote populations, the balance between respect for traditions and protection against potentially harmful practices remains a challenge. Haaland's history is not simply about the biological dangers of consanguinity, but about how isolation, geographical, educational, and ideological, can create cycles of suffering that transcend generations. At the same time, it is a history about human resilience and the ability to adapt, even after generations of isolation. In 2015, the Haaland Center for Population Genetic Studies was inaugurated at the University of Kentucky, dedicated to researching rare genetic diseases and developing extension programs for isolated rural communities. Partially funded by an anonymous donation, it is believed the benefactor is one of the family's descendants who wants to transform the legacy of suffering into a resource for prevention and education. If you have watched this far, it is because you like this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here," so I can meet you and know who really likes the stories here on the channel. Check it out if you are already subscribed to this channel so as not to lose any of the most impactful cases that reveal the hidden consequences of social and genetic isolation. Each subscription helps us continue bringing these important stories that educate and warn about the real dangers that can hide in isolated communities. Don't forget to leave your like and share this video with anyone you think would also be interested in this impressive story of American medicine. The Haaland case remains a powerful reminder that scientific knowledge, when accessible to all, has the power to release entire communities from cycles of avoidable suffering. In Sarah Haaland's words, "My family's true tragedy was not the genes we shared, but the information we never had access to. The knowledge would have been our salvation." Today, as we look back on the Haaland history, we see not only a family tragedy but a microcosm that reflects broader questions about how societies deal with the balance between tradition and scientific progress. In a world where isolated communities still exist, where old beliefs sometimes clash with modern knowledge, the legacy of the Haalands reminds us of our collective responsibility to ensure that knowledge which saves lives is available to everyone, regardless of how distant they may be from centers of power and education.